Throughout the course of American history, there are many individuals who were misunderstood and greatly villainized during their time, just to get forgotten to the sands of time. There are, perhaps, fewer misunderstood, villainized, yet still very fascinating historical figures than that of the former U.S. Senator and Louisiana Governor, Huey P. Long Jr., aka the Kingfish. Huey Long's legacy, when remembered, is very mixed, as many of his programs or policy proposals, such as the flagship national level plan, the Share Wealth program, were and are still seen as radical and very socialist in nature. His political strategies were also a bit murky, as Long was always pushing the law to its limit to get an upper hand over his opponents, as was the case especially when he served as the governor of Louisiana. However, Long was a man of the people, and being a left-wing populist, had widespread appeal and support amongst the working-class voters during the turbulent economic times of the late 1920s through 1930s. For all of Huey's faults, he very frequently delivered some successful results with his policies, at least during his time serving as Louisiana governor. For this presentation, I'll be referencing the biography Huey Long, written by a very respected academic and author, T. Harry Williams, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his work, Huey Long, and taught history most notably at LSU. Now, with that general background and credentials for my source is established, or source rather, let's take a dive into the life of the Kingfish himself, Huey P. Long, Jr. Huey P. Long, Jr. was born to a Louisiana family in northern Louisiana on the 30th of August, 1893, in rural Winfield. At the time, northern Louisiana was one of the poorest areas of Louisiana. Despite that, Huey's family was fairly well off compared to others in rural Louisiana at the time. This actually is a contradiction to the image that Huey portrayed about his childhood. Indeed, T. Harry Williams addressed this in his biography, Huey Long, as Williams mentions, Huey intentionally misconstrued the economic situation of his family to sound as if he was raised in poverty to gain more of a political appeal. Williams directly described that as Huey's reasoning for his false portrayal of his childhood, as he wrote in his book, Huey Long, quote, "He was acting naturally enough out of his political motives to secure a political advantage." However, growing up in a mostly impoverished area did greatly impact Huey's beliefs, and fostered within him both a deep hatred of the powerful corporations and the corrupt political class that controlled the state and federal governments, as well as the desire to fix the problems that plagued the society of his time. Huey, by most accounts, was a very capable student. Indeed, according to T. Harry Williams, in his book, Huey Long, his fellow peers described him as, quote, "I guess he was smart," and was also known as the smart aleck kid. Indeed, Huey even managed to jump from 7th to 8th grade after passing a couple series of tests put out by the 8th grade teacher, yet again demonstrating an example of his intellectual potential. Indeed, during a school trip to a state academic rally and debate at LSU, Huey managed to convince the judge to let him in the debate during the debate event. Huey even managed to place third overall, being immediately put into the Final Four after the crowd heard his first speech. This won him a full scholarship to LSU, but he was unable to actually use it, but held a special fondness towards LSU for the rest of his life. Despite his impressive academic potential, Huey left school during his senior year of high school, for what Williams described as unclear reasons. However, Long would use his aptitude and ability to rally a crowd to his advantage throughout his career. It was at this point in Huey's life where he would work as a salesman and attended various colleges and completed his studies at Tulane University Law School in 1914. After attending law school and using a lot of self-education through reading, Huey passed the Louisiana State Bar exam and practiced law for a couple years, which was very impressive considering his history of having a rather unconventional educational career. Huey then practiced law for a couple of years while simultaneously staying active in observing the political world. He then turned to the one career path that he always had a desire for, that of course being the political path. Huey started his political career by being elected onto the Louisiana State Public Service Commission. It was there that Huey began to act on his anti-corporate stances and began to prosecute major corporations that held great influence over the state of Louisiana at the time, most notably Standard Oil. However, Huey always having an eye on the goal for a higher off political office and wanting to take a next step in his career, decided to start running for launched two gubernatorial campaigns as a progressive Democrat, of course, in Louisiana in 1924 and 1928, respectively. After initially losing his first race, he began to gather momentum as his movement grew, as many working class voters began to see the corruption within within the state government, which was in large part greatly exposed by Huey during his initial 1924 campaign. With his newfound support, Huey again ran for governor in 1928 and rallied mass discontent from the poor economy, devastation caused by the Great Flood in 1927, and the general disdain for the political elite and corporations by the working class to win the gubernatorial race pretty handedly. Interestingly enough, it was during his 1928 campaign where Huey introduced his famous slogan of "Every man is a king, but no one wears the crown." It wasn't it wasn't long. Oh, here's the sources, by the way, for the last bit. It wasn't long after Huey took office as Louisiana's governor that he quickly began to take action and enact his policies into law. Policies such as enacting lower natural gas costs for major cities, better funding for schools, and government-sponsored literary programs and free textbook programs for all Louisiana schools, and the funding and general creation and modernization of Louisiana's road infrastructure. In order to fund the infrastructure projects and social programs, Huey and the Louisiana state legislature had to create new taxes and bond programs, and particularly a tax was placed on gasoline and car licenses. However, Huey was quite a shrewd politician, and very often used some rather unconventional and unusual and very shady methods to establish and pass his legislation. It was very common to see Huey at the state legislature building, directing his supporters and allies on what to vote for, what not to vote for, and even taking part in the legislative process, such as creating legislation himself as governor. Huey used various intimidation tactics and pressure politics to force his opponents to accept his political policies. Williams mentions many examples of such as, in order to pass his policy of fixed lower gas prices in New Orleans, Huey pressured the City Council of New Orleans and the gas company that ran the natural gas into New Orleans at the time, the NOPIS or SI, into conceding his demands, as he threatened to pass a bill that would otherwise undercut both if they didn't agree. This highlights one of Huey's faults, as this was a very controversial political and governing strategy. Despite that, however, Huey remained quite a popular figure in Louisiana amongst the general population, much to the dismay of the traditional conservative political elite that used to run Louisiana prior to Huey's election. However, Huey, during his time as governor, also faced major controversies, such as when the Louisiana state legislature attempted to impeach him over various notable allegations, such as conspiring with the Texan Oil Company. Despite managing to gather some support from Huey's own allies, the impeachment failed after being voted down in the state Senate. Interestingly, the reasons behind the mass push for the impeachment was thanks to pressure from the oil lobby that the oil lobby had on the state, as well as officials' hatred towards Huey by his general opponents, typically the traditionally more conservative-minded Democrats at the time. There were even some of his own allies who decided Huey was going too far with his policies. This was because Huey wanted to introduce a new tax on oil production for oil refineries in Louisiana, which was one of the largest industries in the state at the time. Huey then spent the rest of his term targeting political opponents through tactics such as primarying them out of public office. Huey was also responsible for helping guide Louisiana during the first half of the Great Depression with the heavy use of the powerful state government. In 1923, here's another one of my resources. If you guys want to pause the video through here, you can kind of see for yourself my sources of where I get these from, or at least directly from the book, of course. In 1923, Huey successfully ran in Louisiana and was elected to the United States Senate, again as a progressive Democrat. Much like how he won the governor's race 4 years prior, Huey rallied the large base of voters on his popular rhetoric, capitalizing on the working class disdain for the political elite. Furthermore, the onset of the Great Depression found Huey's strong government With the onset of the Great Depression, many found Huey's strong government programs, with increased welfare programs especially, to be very appealing. Indeed, Williams noted that Huey was very eager to push the Senate leadership towards adapting more hardline approaches to regulating big business. Most notably and well known was perhaps Huey's plan to redistribute wealth, which would evolve over the next few years during his Senate term. Huey had laid out his vision for an elaborate economic plan to solve the economic problems and general disparity that existed within the United States. He would spend his time working with his fellow progressives, attempting to get the legislation passed by President Hoover, who Huey was also encouraged the Senate to greatly pressure the Senate. During the 1932 presidential election, Huey was also a supporter of FDR, believing that he would have a similar business regulations and distributionist approach to the economy as he did. Despite supporting FDR during his 1923 32 presidential campaign, Huey began to feel a little bit disillusioned with FDR, even before he took office, as he didn't comply with all of his programs as he initially hoped. This led to a political rivalry between Huey and President Roosevelt, FDR, as Huey was very adamant that Roosevelt adopt his populist left-wing policies. Interestingly, it was pressure from Huey and his progressive allies in the Senate which convinced President Roosevelt to pass his infamous Glass-Steagall Act. Huey wasn't certainly one to hold back his criticisms about President Roosevelt or his non-progressive fellow senators, at least after realizing Roosevelt's plans didn't fully align with his. Huey was stated as saying, "The trouble is, Roosevelt hasn't taken all of my ideas, just some of them." This culminated in a rather interesting scenario, as Huey Long was one of the only progressive senators to vote against parts of President Roosevelt, FDR, and the Democratic Party's flagship policy, the infamous New Deal. At least parts of it, that was. Huey also wrote and published 2 different books during his time in the Senate, Every Man a King and Share Our Wealth, which further helped highlight his plans to the public, but received mixed reviews. Due to Huey's clear-cut, unique political positions and his bombastic yet clever personality, he was able to put himself in as the leader of the progressive left wing of the Democratic Party. He also continued to use his public appeal to exert influence over the politics of his home state in Louisiana at this time. This placed Huey in a position to potentially rival President Roosevelt, FDR, in the 1936 presidential primary. President Roosevelt even considered Huey one of the most dangerous men in the country. It was a lifelong goal of Huey's to become president of the United States, and he made both his intentions to run and his policy plans clear in the book My First Days in the White House. However, before the book was released, here's again some major references to be used. However, before the book released, Huey went on a trip back to Louisiana to meet with the state-level officials at the Louisiana State House, as was quite common with Huey. While walking through the State House building, Huey was shot by assassin Carl Weiss, who after a quick skirmish was quickly shot to death by Huey's bodyguards. Huey was taken to the Our Lady of the Lakes Hospital in Baton Rouge, where he would undergo surgery. However, due to internal bleeding in the kidneys that was discovered after his first surgery, the doctors couldn't conduct a second operation because they suspected with Huey's current condition at that point, it would have killed him for certain. Eventually, on the 10th of September, 1935, 2 days after being shot, Huey P. Long Jr. died of internal bleeding. Again, the major sources there for you all to look at if you'd like. Now, it's important that we should remember Huey Long for a couple of reasons. We can get a lot of life lessons out of studying his life. Huey was certainly a talented politician who wasn't afraid to go against the grain and do what he thought was right. Indeed, Huey's rise to prominence from a rural kid to an influential United States senator demonstrates how hard work and determination can make a major difference in achieving one's goals. Equally as important, we need to remember Huey's flaws, as they highlight how narcissism and ego can get in the way of compromise and genuine discord, and alienate many in society in the process. In our current political climate, where many believe the rise in battle between populist and more conventional political establishments is unique to our time, the story of Huey Long reminds us that our nation has gone through something similar before. In essence, the story of Huey Long should be remembered for both the good and the bad, and it shows us that history isn't always completely black and white.